Hello and welcome to the Geocurrents series on global demography. Today's lecture is going to look at European populations patterns and processes from 1700 to around 1875. I'll look at death rate figures and birth rate figures as well. Much of the emphasis will be on Britain and France. Other countries will be covered as well. And there'll also be quite a bit of discussion about the food supply in Europe that was able to underwrite population growth during this period. I'll start with a slide I've shown before. It's a very revealing slide, I think. The red line shows annual population growth for the entire world, and the green shows world population. The point I want to make with this is the increase in the rate of growth around 1700 on the left side of the graph. But then what the graph really reveals, though, is the explosive acceleration of global population around 1925. I'll talk about that later. I'm concerned now with the earlier period. And this is a period when there was a tremendous amount of population growth, particularly in Europe. I'll show you a couple of graphs showing Europe in particular, and all these graphs should be taken with a pretty healthy degree of skepticism. And you'll see there's quite a bit of difference between this one and the next one I'll show. But what this is showing is a inflection point in that in the line, the blue line, showing an acceleration of population growth around 1750. The second one shows that same sort of acceleration a little after 1800. The precise date is not that important. What is important to note is by the middle of the 18th century, European population was expanding much quicker than it had been, and that's going to continue for some time. It's also important to note that it was not the same in every country in Europe by any means. It's a pretty revealing graph, and again, these figures must be taken with a certain grain of salt. We can see increases in population of all these countries noted, but some much more than others. Russia, in particular, you could see a huge growth in population after around 1725. France, the graph anyway, is showing steady growth, but not nearly as rapidly as in, well, Russia as well as Italy, England, and Ireland in particular. Let's take Russia first. One of the reasons for population growth was territorial expansion. On the far west of this map, you can see sort of dark orange territories acquired in the 18th century. This is a much more densely populated part of Russia, central part of the country. Siberia, for example, very sparsely populated. But on the European edge of Russia, Russia was acquiring territories that had quite a few inhabitants. Also, in the very southwest of that region, in what is now Ukraine, particularly southern Ukraine, these were territories acquired from the Ottoman Empire, and in particular its subsidiary organization, the Crimean Khanate, by the Russian Empress Catherine the Great in the second part of the 18th century. These were lands with very rich, fertile black soils that had previously been fairly sparsely inhabited, mostly by nomadic pastoralists. This became a zone of major pioneer settlement, if you will, of people plowing in the grasslands, turning it into grain fields. And in a situation like that, generally you have very rapid population growth just from large families able to expand sort of in this new agricultural zone. Some similar things were going on in the southwestern part of Siberia. Most of Siberia is not agriculturally productive or even possible for agriculture due to the harsh climate, soil, permafrost, and other conditions. But there's some pretty rich farmland in the southwestern part of Siberia, and there was a major expansion of pioneer settlement at the time, coincident with a higher birth rate and growing population. We have a lot of demographic information on Britain, and I'll talk about it quite a bit. This graph is showing population change in England and Wales from 1700 to 2000. What I like about it is it's showing both the total population in the black line, but the birth rate in the red line and the death rate in the blue line. And really fascinating thing you could see from this is a real plummeting of the death rate after about 1750. It sort of bottoms out, and then it starts rising around 1800, although it doesn't rise to the height it had been previously. And you could see the birth rate staying relatively constant through the 1700s and eventually dropping, but the real drop doesn't come till the late 1800s. And also you can see a certain rise there around 1850, curiously paralleling the death rate line, to the extent that the figures here are accurate. The post-population increase in Britain, a lot of this came from a reduced death rate as more than an increased birth rate, because you see the birth rate doesn't increase by much. There is this increase in death rate after 1800. I'll talk about that later, but I do want to note that despite this increase in the death rate, there's actually acceleration of population growth as the birth rate remains much higher than the death rate. So why was there this decline in the British death rate after 1730 or 50? And it's not just Britain. We see the same thing in France. We see the same thing in many European countries. But I'll focus here on Britain, where we do have very good data. One important issue is there are relatively few epidemics. The bubonic plague is essentially a thing of the past. If you remember from previous lecture, mid to late 1600s, there are some very serious plague outbreaks in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. But it's pretty much gone by this period. It's no longer a problem. Another issue is inoculation for smallpox, and I have some slides on that in a second. But it is important to note that smallpox was the most lethal disease in Europe and in Britain as well in the 18th century. And by the mid-19th century, it was a very minor cause of death. Another thing I'll talk about at some length are improved food supplies, in particular the agricultural revolution. And this had occurred at a time of relatively favorable climatic conditions. There's still a little ice age, but conditions have moderated quite a bit since the low point of that little ice age in the mid-1600s. And then I'll turn to the increase of the British death rate after 1800. I'll look at the surge of tuberculosis, rise of what we might call unsanitary mill towns, and the coming of cholera from India. But back to the decline in the death rate, a really important event here was the introduction of smallpox inoculation. And we can trace this to one person, Mary Montagu, who was the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans were already practicing inoculation. It probably originated in China, and I'll talk about that in regard to China in the next lecture. But it's important to note what inoculation is. This is not vaccination, although it's related to it. What inoculation involved was taking actual pus from the scab of a person with smallpox, but somebody who had a mild form of it, because there was a significant amount of variation in the lethality, if you will, of smallpox, the virulence of the virus. And so in mild cases, the idea was it would be less virulent. You could inoculate somebody, you'd give them smallpox. And there's some pretty good information on this, something that's called variolation, but it would result in a death rate, but a pretty low one, from about 0.5% to 2% for people who were intentionally inoculated. But with natural smallpox, probably about 60% of the people would get it, and there'd be about a 30% death rate. And also for survival, those who survived it, often a very significant amount of scarring. Interesting little side note, in our historical films of the period, we almost never see the kind of facial and entire body scarring that was very common from people who had survived pretty severe cases of smallpox. Actual vaccination comes quite a bit later, at the end of the century. Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine of 1798. This began the process of vaccination. The term vaccine comes from Latin term for cattle, because this was done by using the cowpox virus. So it's a very closely related virus to smallpox. Cows often had it. And women who were cow milkmaids often became infected with cowpox, but it's pretty minor. Blisters on their hands, I believe, was the most common symptom. So what Jenner did was to take a woman who had been infected with a cowpox virus, take pus from the sores on her hands, inoculate that into a child who got a mild case of cowpox, and then to inoculate the same person with smallpox. And the patient was completely unaffected because he had acquired immunity to smallpox. Not the sort of experiment that one would conduct today, but it is generally thought to have had major impact on health by beginning the vaccination process. So the next topic I'm going to turn to would be the agricultural revolution, which preceded and accompanied the Industrial Revolution in Britain. It also occurred in the Netherlands, although the Netherlands did not experience an Industrial Revolution until much later than Britain. So this was perhaps a necessary precondition for the Industrial Revolution, but it certainly was not the cause. So the agricultural revolution in Britain, anyway, is usually thought to have begun around 1700 and to have continued really all the way up to the present in one sense. One of the first steps in the agricultural revolution was to get rid of the fallow period. So the traditional medieval system, which had continued all the way up to the 1600s, was agricultural areas. You'd have an agricultural system based on a single village with these very large fields. Each household would have a couple of long strips in those 3 fields, which they would use as their own production land. They didn't own it, but it was theirs by customary rights, if you will. So anyway, one of these very large fields with all these different separate strips would be planted jointly by everybody, one with a spring crop of corn, according to this, but that's corn in the British sense, meaning essentially wheat or barley, sometimes oats or rye, but a main staple grain crop. You'd have another with winter corn, which would be fall-sown wheat or barley. And then you'd have one that would be fallow, just simply left in stubble. Animals would be able to graze on the stubble. You'd also have common grazing land, common meadow land that everyone in the village could use. And that is gradually replaced by a 4-course system, trying to bring all the land that's possible into cultivation and not have any fallow, to go from a wheat crop and to one of turnips. Pretty lowly vegetable, if you will, but the turnips were used for feeding cattle. Turnips, like closely related radishes, have very deep tap roots that can get into the subsoil and pull up nutrients that would be otherwise unavailable for grain crops, for example. That would allow more cattle, which would allow more traction power, more meat and dairy production as well, so it had benefits of its own. Also more manure for the fields for maintaining fertility. And then barley, and then you take the same land and turn it to clover or ryegrass. Clover in particular, clover is a legume, which means that it is able to fix nitrogen. So nitrogen is one of the key plant nutrients. All plants need large amounts of it. The atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, but that nitrogen is inaccessible to plants. But a number of plants, particularly those in the legume family, but others as well, have nodules on their roots with bacteria that can take that atmospheric nitrogen and make it accessible for plants. So this is a system that can maintain fertility without fallow, and actually a higher level of fertility than you had in the traditional 3-field system. So it's a major improvement. It's going to produce more food, and that's going to improve nutrition and simply allow more people to survive through times of want without as much debilitation that comes from low food intake. So you're going to have a healthier population and population growth. And there are a lot of other things that happened in the agricultural revolution. I won't go into great detail. A lot of this came from abroad. For example, improved plows that came from the Dutch, but ultimately probably from China. A very controversial thing called the enclosure movement, which is closely associated with this movement away from the three-field system, which essentially means enclosing these fields, often literally with hedgerows, but instead of having the land sort of jointly managed by peasant households, it's going to be heavily managed by entrepreneurial farmers who are leasing land from the landholders or improving landholders, aristocrats or gentry who take an interest in this sort of thing and start intensely managing it. It's actually highly controversial because the poorest peasants sort of got dispossessed in the process. They no longer had village common lands that they could graze animals on or gather fuel from. But it did result in much higher yields and improved food supply. I mentioned the rise of improving landlords and entrepreneurial farmers. Also, huge transportation improvements so that food can be moved much more easily from the countryside to the growing towns, also from areas that may have a local shortage because of weather conditions or other things. So moving towards a national market. But the 1700s was a big period of road building and canal building as well. Canals are very efficient for moving bulk goods. So before the railroads, which started about 1820s, you have this transportation improvement with roads. With roads, the big issue was simply drainage. A few Roman roads had survived, but in some form, but most of the roads in Europe up to the 1600s would become impassable during really wet periods. Vehicles would sink to the mud down to their axles, and you simply couldn't go on them. So improved roads involved building them up higher and putting crushed gravel on them to make a hard but permeable surface. And that resulted in huge improvements in speed of transport. Also, we get this intensive selective breeding of livestock, so they produce more meat or milk or wool, depending on what you're raising them for, and labor-reducing technological developments such as the seed drill, a mechanical device for putting seeds in the soil. And just a few more slides on this. Some key figures. Charles Townshend, you can see an aristocrat, also a prominent Whig politician, but very much known for his enthusiasm for the agricultural revolution, and particularly for the turnip growing, hence Turnip Townshend. Or some key figures in selective breeding. I have here Robert Bakewell and Thomas Coke of Norfolk, the latter being a very wealthy aristocrat. You can see inherited a 30,000 acre estate at 22. But whereas an awful lot of these landed aristocrats or gentry would devote most of their time to leisure activities, gambling, riding, fox hunting, shooting, and the like, socializing, obviously. There were quite a few who really took an interest in their estates and to improving them. All was beneficial for them, as that would increase the output and the money that they made from their land. And finally, I have here Jethro Tull. I note not the 1970s progressive rock band, which is still touring and I think even producing albums. But for some reason, they took their name from one of these 18th century figures of the agricultural revolution, Jethro Tull, who invented the seed drill. The traditional way that grain would be planted would be simply to, after the field had been plowed and prepared, to simply walk through and throw the grain out, and then maybe run a harrow over it to lightly cover it. But birds are going to pick up a lot of the seeds. A lot of them are not going to be adequately covered or adequately spaced, and you get the seed drill that can mechanically place them in the ground, you're going to get much higher returns. And we could really see this in figures, the various issues in the agricultural revolution. So look, we'll just take wheat here on the far left. We have bushels per acre. You can see it actually drops after the Black Plague. We have 8.71 bushels per acre in the late 1200s, and then by the 1400s down to 5.9. With less population, which occurred after the Black Death, you don't really need to have as intensive agriculture as you had had before, because you don't have as many people that you need to feed. But population continues to grow, and then the agricultural revolution comes along and supplies the food necessary for that. So you could see by 1800, we've got over 20 bushels per acre, and that's before you get the real modern developments in fertilizer and the like, which comes in the second half of the 19th century. But you can see those are significant increases, and we can see it for all the crops here. Another thing I'd note, too, is that up until 1846, at least from the Napoleonic period up to the middle 1800s, there was virtually no import of grain into Britain. Parliament had passed these very restrictive corn laws to prevent that from happening. This is something that greatly enriched landowners who dominated Parliament at the time, particularly the House of Lords. But the industrialists are gaining power and are pushing against this. They want cheap grain to help them maintain their labor forces on low wages, which they did. So eventually there was enough pressure, and the 1846 the corn laws are abolished, which means the beginning of it's a gradual process, but the beginning of the huge imports of grain from what is now Ukraine and the Russian Empire, from the United States. After the Civil War, the United States becomes the main exporter, which goes a long way to undoing the linkage between food production and local population, because after that, Britain is not going to have to depend on its own food production to support its population. It can draw on a global market. Next topic I want to take on the importance of new crops in increasing the food production of Europe and population, therefore. So this is the what sometimes called the Columbian Exchange, the exchange of forms of life across the Atlantic in the wake of Christopher Columbus. So you can see coming from the Eastern Hemisphere, in the bottom right here, we have diseases, and I've talked about that previously. Some diseases went the other way, but very few. Syphilis would have been the most important, probably syphilis. A lot of livestock from Eurasia to the Americas, grain crops, some fruits and other crops, but really important crops going the other direction from the Americas to Europe and to Asia as well. Potatoes, corn or maize, sweet potatoes, these are some of the most important, some of the ones I'll talk about, simply because they're so productive and can feed large amounts of people. Potatoes, a classic example. Note that it was known in Europe. It was brought back pretty early, but it was feared and very seldom eaten. And the reason why it was feared is people had enough botanical knowledge to note that flowers are very similar to those of deadly nightshade and other flowers in the nightshade or Solanaceae plant family. These were noted in Europe mostly as poisons, and also a lot of plants that were highly psychoactive, although hallucinogenic, but in the category of deliriants, meaning people who take them are not really necessarily aware that their hallucinations are unreal. So these were plants that had been used by supposedly in witchcraft, for example. Plants like mandrake, henbane, nightshade. So this was a plant family that was considered dangerous and poisonous. There was tomatoes are in the same family, and there was for a long time, for a couple hundred years, a real reluctance to eat tomatoes. But potatoes were the most important ones simply because they are so productive. You could see here well, maybe the best way to look at this graph, this table, I should say, is in the column on the far right. Acres of land needed to provide enough food for one person for 1 year. And you can see for the acreage for wheat, 1.7, and then to potatoes, 1/2. So far more productive just in producing mere calories. Also, potatoes are relatively nutritious. They don't have much protein and they're missing some vitamins, but a diet based on potatoes, add dairy products and some simple vegetables like kale, that's adequate nutrition for a person. And so, what happened in some areas of Europe by the 1700s was a real move of the peasantry to potatoes. And this is particularly areas where peasants were sort of more exploited. And the grain that they were growing was was unavailable for them. It was going to their landlords and sort of other wealthy contingents in society. And they were reduced to living on garden plots where they were cultivating mostly potatoes. And Ireland is where this happened more than anywhere else. Ireland being, well, after 1802, it was officially part of the United Kingdom, but it was really an exploited colonial periphery, if you will. I have on this slide a cover of a book, Internal Colonialism, the Celtic Fringe in British National Development. So Ireland turned intensively to potatoes. That made it highly vulnerable. In Peru and Bolivia, where potatoes are native, there are many dozens of different varieties and strains, I believe over 100. But in Ireland, almost all potatoes were from one variety, one strain. A fungal infestation crossed over the Atlantic, and with this very low degree of genetic diversity and very intensive use of potatoes, anyway, these fields were highly susceptible. Also, you had some very wet periods, it's particularly during humid periods when the potato blight, which is a fungus, will spread. And the blight just wiped out most of the potato crop in Ireland, resulting in a mass famine. You can see here total deaths estimated at around 1 million people. That's out of about 8 million in Ireland. And a lot of this is from indirect death as people are weakened rather than outright starvation, but it's death just the same. It is very important to note that Ireland was continuing to export food to England during this period. Landlords were collecting their share, if you will, and even as the Irish were starving, food was flowing to England during this time. The potato blight resulted in the progressive depopulation of Ireland over the next half century. So to read this table, you got to start at the bottom. Population of Ireland around 8 million in 1841. And then you can see it progressively dropping and bottoming out in 1901 at about 4.5 million. So almost half of the population gone. There are three things that are happening here. Yeah, people were outright dying in the famine itself. Then there was massive migration, mostly to the United States. And that continues through the century, and also a real notable fertility decline. The map shows just a few urban areas like Dublin and Cork and Belfast increasing in population from 1841 to 1851, but just massive depopulation, with much of the West, which was the more humid area, the more Irish Gaelic speaking part of the country, suffering this massive depopulation. But as noted previously, one of the effects of the potato famine was a real reduction of fertility. So here we have a very revealing graph of the total fertility rate, children per woman in Ireland, from 1850 all the way up to 2020. And you can see in 1850, just a bit after the potato famine had hit, average woman having over 4 children, and then notice how that drops and bottoms out at about 2.5 children per woman in 1930, and then really increases, especially after World War II, the baby boom period, back up to 4, and then dropping down again. And it's now well below replacement level. But this was generally thought to have been due to really delayed marriage. People not being able to marry until they had a sort of a more secure position, and often this is late 20s into the 30s, and also relatively high rates of celibacy. It's thought that there was not much recourse to artificial birth control, which did exist in crude forms in the period, or even natural birth control. Well, there certainly may have been some of that, things like the rhythm method, but a very devoutly Catholic population at this time, so it would not have been much from artificial birth control or abortion or things like that. Mostly, anyway, the main idea is mostly because people simply abstaining from sexual relations through delayed marriage, celibacy, and so on. I'll briefly just talk about the spread of corn, or maize as it's called in Europe, which is also very significant because, again, it's more productive, produces more calories than wheat or rye or oats or barley, the main grain crops. This is modern figures after the modern technological developments. But we can see here wheat producing 4 million calories an acre and corn up to 15 million. And that corn can't be grown everywhere. Ireland's too cold and wet, essentially, for corn as a grain crop. But central France, northern Italy, Spain, Balkans, many areas of Europe, corn became the major staple grain. One other thing important to note about staple grains is people in pre-modern times, their diet was often really dominated by a certain staple crop, like potatoes in Ireland. Potatoes and a little bit of milk, a little bit of kale, or a few other vegetables. That's what Irish basically lived on. But a lot of people in southern Europe ended up living mostly on corn, and that had a major health impact, the spread of pellagra, a very devastating disease. Classic symptoms are diarrhea, dermatitis, dementia, and death eventually, or not necessarily. It depends on how severe it is. There's a map of Pavia in northern Italy with pellagra rates in an earlier period. Problem with pellagra is it's very simple. It's a lack of niacin or vitamin B3, and it just shows how corn consumption just would have dominated people's diets because there are many other crops that have niacin. Actually, corn has it as well, but it has to be made available by adding an alkali to the grain. And peoples in the New World knew how to do this. In North America, for example, hominy was eaten. I think it was just addition of ash, and certainly in making tortillas in Mesoamerica, the process was done. And eventually it was, you can see it was first described in Spain in 1735 to note the connection between this. And eventually this process of treating corn with an alkali to release the niacin was developed in Europe as well. Back to Britain and its population issues. In the late 1700s, and particularly in the early 1800s, and all the way through the 1800s, you see massive increase in urbanization. And England particularly becomes the world's first mostly urban society, England and southern Scotland, I should say. Northern England and southern Scotland were the centers of the Industrial Revolution. That's where it began. In the very early stages of industrialization, factories were located in rural areas where there was an abundant water supply of falling water, using water mills to power the machines to spin cotton, which is where the Industrial Revolution began. But by the 1800s, steam engines are coming in a big way, and factories are being associated with these growing mill towns of northern England and southern Scotland. So places like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool, Glasgow have these just surging populations. A lot of them had been relatively small cities or even villages previously, but they become the center of these industrial production zones. So the line with the dots on it shows the percent urban population. You could see on the far right gives the percentage. So you could see back in 1600, England was maybe only 10% urban. By 1800, it's up over 25-30%. And by 1900, it's more like 70%. So this first real urbanization of a society. And as I've mentioned before, cities were not healthy places even during this period. This really starts to change after about 1870 when you get modern water and sewage systems, but that takes a long time to happen. There's little movement at first. There's an awful lot of crowding. There's also not adequate heat or ventilation in a lot of places, and quite cold in the winter. People huddle together for warmth and working extremely hard in the factories. This resulted in a rising death rate. Now, because the Industrial Revolution first occurred in Britain, in northern England and Scotland, you do get this huge surge in estimated gross domestic product per capita. By 1850, Britain was the workshop of the world, as it's sometimes called. And mechanized factory production is spreading outside, and by the late 1800s, Germany is really going to be able to overtake Britain in industrial production. But the first half of the 19th century, it's mostly British, and you could just see this huge surge. Very interesting graph, and certain figures, so take it with some skepticism. But it's showing in 1500, Italy with the highest per capita GDP, and Britain clustered with a lot of other countries in Europe and in Asia as well. And then you see this huge divergence. By 1800, you could see it's pretty substantial, and then it's going to increase, and especially compared to Asian countries. But what's really important to note is it was not shared wealth. There's actually little increase in wages for industrial workers and other workers for that matter. You can see in this graph, it's the darker blue, which shows average real wages, taking into account inflation. And you can see some increase. You can actually see it dropping from 1750 down to 1800 when the Industrial Revolution is just starting, and then increasing a bit up to 1900, but not that much. It doesn't really take off till the mid-20th century. So the wealth being generated by the Industrial Revolution was going to the middle class, upper class, and not much to the working class. Some, but not that much. So you have a situation of people in these new mills and these crowded new mill towns, inadequate diets in many cases, inadequate sanitation, no understanding of germ theory of disease, and you get the spread of tuberculosis. It had been around a long time, but by the 19th century, we can see from 1800 to 1870, killed roughly 25% of the adult population of Europe, and a lot of relatively young people are dying from it as well. And a lot of people sick for many, many years, so a lot of morbidity associated with this. And even up to 1910, up to a third of English deaths of young people, 15 to 34, as from tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was essentially solved after World War II with antibiotics, although it is coming back. I do want to just make a couple comments on tuberculosis and fashion. Uh, it's an interesting topic, and I have had some questions about demographic patterns and cultural processes. Uh, but there's been quite a bit of work by scholars on how tuberculosis shaped Victorian fashion. The Victorians romanticized the disease and its effects in the gradual build to death. And basically, what this would mean would be very pale, sort of translucent skin, very slender appearance, basically from people wasting away. And somehow this got incorporated into the culture. At least many scholars say so. And some would even go a step further and say that so-called goth fashion that we have today in some quarters of society is rooted in tuberculosis. Take this as you will. And as I briefly mentioned, tuberculosis is coming back. It's actually extremely common. It's said that almost 25% of global population are carriers of the tuberculosis bacteria, but for most people are completely asymptomatic. Their bodies are able to fight it off. So weakened conditions from inadequate diet or other sicknesses or so on weaken the body and then make tuberculosis take off and become sickening or even causing sickness or even death. And we do have this very troubling rise of multi-drug resistance tuberculosis. Like I say, it was essentially solved by antibiotics, but it's around again. And in the 1990s, especially, Russian prisons were considered sort of incubators for these new, more virulent and, or at least drug-resistant forms of TB. Moving on from that, though, I do want to talk about cholera. So cholera, a very deadly disease. It almost certainly originated in eastern India or what is now Bangladesh. It was pretty local, and in the early 1800s, you had this first global cholera epidemic through much of Asia. It didn't reach Europe, but the second global cholera outbreak would reach Europe and would become quite deadly. Across Europe, particularly in cities. Cholera is waterborne disease from people polluting their own water supplies and with the spread of the disease anyway. I won't talk about cholera much more, but I do want to note that in 1854, John Snow, British doctor, used cartography map making to basically solve the mystery of cholera. His very famous map showing outbreak of cholera in particular cholera epidemic in a pandemic that hit Britain. And you can see people, he was actually able to map out people getting cholera and show that in this one part of London, they were all getting water from one pump, the Broad Street pump. And he was able to deduce that the plague was being spread by the water from this pump. And this led to two things. One is it was sort of the beginning of the science of epidemiology, and it also helped propel sanitation advances that I'll talk about in a later lecture. Okay, the next topic that I want to go into is the divergence of British and French fertility rates. Started in the 1700s and continued through the late 1800s. So France is well known in demographic studies for being the first country, one of the first countries of the world. I did mention Ireland. I'll also talk about Japan in the next lecture. But to really see its fertility rate drop significantly. These two graphs from the United Kingdom, Britain, and France both show roughly the same period. And you can see in 1800, the British fertility rate was already much higher than that of France, and fertility in Britain increases up to about 5.5 in the early 1800s, where in France it's plummeting and is dropping down to about 3 by 1860 or so. It will drop in the United Kingdom after 1880. I cut off the graph where it really starts to decline. I'll show you that later on. But it remains quite high during this period. And this is a period of industrial ascendancy of Britain. It's one reason why wages remained low in those mills, is because you still had having massive population growth because of the high fertility rate, much exceeding the death rate. Whereas in France, you have this very different circumstance of people intentionally limiting their fertility. Let's just take France over a longer period of time. There's pretty good data of the fertility rate here, and it's very interesting. We could see real drops in fertility during wars. I have the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, World War II, and then real rebounds afterwards. Note that by 1900, the French fertility rate was already approaching replacement level. It dropped well below it during World War I, comes back, but then by World War II, it's below the replacement level again. Then you have the baby boom, where it rises up to about 3. I'll talk about the baby boom in a subsequent lecture, and then dropping after that. We can do a similar thing in the United Kingdom, and I would just note that its fertility rate remained very high until around 1880, and then a long-term and quite substantial drop, and you could see by 1930s well below the replacement level, and then bouncing up. One reason why I like to show these slides and talk about them is just to note that fertility patterns are not always on this sort of one-way trajectory. It's often portrayed that way. If fertility is dropping, it's often assumed, well, it's just going to continue to drop as it has been. But when we look historically, we see lots of ups and downs. It's also notable that when the fertility really starts to drop in England, it's probably the upper classes where it drops the most. Previously, upper class families and upper middle class families had pretty high birth rates, but by 1900, that is no longer the case. And finally, on the graph on the right, it's just interesting to note how fertility starts to plummet around 1880 in Britain as the death rate plummets as well, and they kind of keep track almost to some degree. Anyway, the situation was not to stay the same. Today, France has the European Union's highest fertility rate, second highest in Europe after little Moldova in 1923, at least according to the Statista information. It's dropped since 2023 and is now only around 1.6, but the European average is around 1.4. So again, things don't stay the same. There's a few important things to correlate with this French decrease in the birth rate well before any other European country, basically about 70 years before most other Western European countries. They're going to follow with a decreased birth rate, but it's going to come quite a bit later. So one is just to note total populations of countries. Compare France, which I've highlighted there, with Britain and Germany. Germany was not a country until 1870s, but we can talk about the land that's currently part of Germany. And you can see France with 22 million in 1700 as opposed to fewer than 6 million in Britain, or only 13 million in what is now Germany. And even in 1800, France still way out overshadows these other countries with about 30 million as opposed to 9 million. In Britain, 18 million in what is now Germany. And then jump ahead to 1900, and now we see Britain and France basically at parity, and Germany with a substantially larger population. You may wonder how in the early 1800s France was able to dominate Europe under Napoleon up until Napoleon's luck turns in 1812. So this would be early in 1812 before the invasion of Russia, height of Napoleon's power. Everything within that red line is essentially dominated by Napoleon. Places like Austria and Prussia maintain their independence, but they had been repeatedly defeated by Napoleon's troops and were sort of forced into this alliance with France. They'd break it as soon as they could. But for a while, it was only the Russian Empire, Sweden, and the United Kingdom that remained outside of Napoleon's domination, Ottoman Empire as well. Well, how was one European country able to do this? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that just France had far more people than any other country. The other would be that after the French Revolution, Napoleon came quite quickly after that. But it was a new kind of country, and Napoleon was able to use mass conscription of peasants and workers or others just to create a gargantuan army. Other European countries had not done that. They certainly didn't. They didn't trust peasantry in the military, and the militaries were dominated by the leaders were the aristocrats, and they had quite a few mercenary troops and others. But they didn't have this kind of patriotic mass conscription that France had pioneered in the Revolution and then afterwards. But the demographic dominance of France partly allowed them to do this. One other thing to note is that during, this is showing all the way from 1500 to 1920, period of massive emigration out of Europe, and it's particularly in the 19th century when this really reaches its height, just huge population outflows from many European countries, but not much from France, relatively little. I'll show you some tables in the next slide. But the green lines, the green lines here are light green lines are showing population leaving from Europe, going to the Americas, to Latin America, to Australia, and a few other places. Europe's population was growing rapidly during the 1800s. Well, this entire period, it was certainly growing after 1500, but it would have grown much more had it not been for the huge export of population. But if we look at different countries, let's take the period from 1640 to 1760, with Britain, about 600,000 leaving Britain for the Americas, 300,000 from Little Portugal, and fewer than 100,000 from France. And those were mostly going to New France, or what is now Quebec, and adjacent areas in Canada. Some figures I've seen as short as few as 60,000. Today there are about over 7 million people in Canada who speak French as a first language, and they are almost all descended from this original colonization process of fewer than 100,000 people. Quebec was noted for its very large families and very rapid population growth. So a lot of people from Quebec migrated to the mill towns in New England and lost their French language at that time, but there was substantial migration, so it was a real population boom. But that was in the Americas, not in France. But then you look at the period from European migration to the Americas, 1760 to 1820. With Britain, again, over 600,000. Portugal still over 100,000, and France at over 20. And then European immigration just to the United States, 1820 to 1978. You can see Germany with almost 7 million, the highest, and Italy with 5 million, UK with almost 5, Ireland with almost 5, Austria-Hungary, old Austro-Hungarian Empire at over 4 million, over 3 million from Russia, even Sweden and Norway, relatively small populations, with around 1 million each, and then France. I was actually surprised that it was as high as it was in France, from France, 750,000, but so much lower than other countries. So that was a big difference between France and other European countries, and because of its lower fertility, largely because of this, there are other factors as well, but it did not have the big immigration flow. Now, there's a big sort of mystery of why fertility declined in France before other countries, although I notice it did decline in Ireland, and I'll talk later about the decline in Japan. Here's a summary of doctoral dissertations of why did fertility decline, looking for correlates in England and France. As I noted, very different timings of the fertility decline, but the abstract of this is the decline in fertility in 19th century Europe is one of economics history's greatest puzzles with no consensus. I would particularly mention the big puzzle of why France so much earlier than other countries. And there's no answer to this that's been established. To me, the most convincing, though, has to do with the fact that France became Europe's first largely secular country. So here's some text from a recent article, France's Baby Bust. Works in progress. But anyway, the author says, using data from online family trees, my work shows how the loosening of traditional religious moral constraints in the old regime of France drove the decline in fertility, setting France off on a wholly different course from England, which is about to see a dramatic increase in its population. So this is in the 1800s. Now, of course, eventually the same decrease is going to happen in France. But the argument here is that the traditional religious beliefs, particularly the teachings of the Catholic Church on fertility, had a big impact. Now, we all know today that there are many people who are practicing Catholics who do not follow the Church's teachings on conception, artificial means of limiting the population, contraception, for example. But I think it's safe to say that people were far more religious in earlier periods. They followed the dictates of the church much more closely. In much of Europe, we'll see this when we talk next week about, or the week after that, about Malthus. I mean, just first, one of the pioneering demographers, he just had a horror of contraception, let alone abortion or infanticide, which had previously been highly practiced, say, by the ancient in the ancient world. But religious teachings really reduced this. But France, by many measures, was the first country to really start de-Christianizing. Most people still maintain some sort of allegiance to the Roman Catholic Church. But already in the 18th century, there was a real movement away from strict following of religions, a lot of skepticism. So we can look, for example, at the French Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was the move among scholars and thinkers in the 18th century towards a view of the world based on reason and evidence rather than on religious teachings. With the French Revolution, this really became institutionalized in the French Revolution, essentially sort of conducted a war against the Catholic Church and religion in general. I just have a few quotes here from this interesting article on the de-Christianization of France during the Revolution, going back to some quotes from Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century. So Voltaire and Diderot are probably the best known philosophes or thinkers of the French Enlightenment. And Voltaire said, every sensible man, every honorable man must hold the Christian religion in horror. And Diderot, the organizer of the famous encyclopedia of the period, said, man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. So there was real hostility. Now, this wasn't everywhere in France. There were still very important segments of French society, particularly outside of Paris, but segments where conservative Roman Catholicism remained the dominant belief system all the way up through the mid-20th century. Since then, there's been a big decline of religiosity across the board. But the argument here, anyway, is that there was enough of this sort of secularization movement away from the teachings of the church, people using various means of controlling fertility, in contradiction to the church's teachings, that is associated with this huge drop in fertility, which would later occur in other countries. Now, one other thing to note is that the Enlightenment was not just a French phenomenon. You saw similar movements away from at least fundamentalist religious teachings, if you will, towards views based much more on reason, on empirical inquiry, and so on. So we can talk about a German Enlightenment, thinkers like Immanuel Kant, talk about a British Enlightenment, even an American Enlightenment. There are books on the subject. But in Germany, and particularly in Britain and the United States, the Enlightenment was not nearly as anti-religious. So here we need to contrast the British, and actually it's a Scottish movement. There were certainly some English thinkers involved, but far more Scots. Again, we're talking about 1700s, 18th century. The Scottish Enlightenment was very much a movement away from sort of the hardcore of Calvinism of the Scottish Presbyterian Church, a movement away from these sort of fundamentalist interpretations, but it was not anti-religious. Some Scots Enlightenment thinkers were. David Hume, very well known, very much a skeptic of skeptical of religion and all sorts of religious thinkings, and he was part of that set. But most of the leading thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment were in favor of religion, albeit a non-fundamentalist interpretation. A lot of them were actually Presbyterian clerics. Today, the only Scottish Enlightenment figures who are well known are David Hume and Adam Smith, but there were a number of them, and they were very influential throughout Britain and very influential in the United States. If you're interested in this, I'd recommend Arthur Herman's book, How the Scots Invented the Modern World. And there's an exaggeration there. Subtitle here, The True Story of How Western Europe's Poorest Nation Created Our World and Everything in It. I think that's an exaggeration, but it's sometimes important to exaggerate just to get attention and these sort of things. And there are plenty of other books on it. One here is Scottish Sense in the Scottish, Common Sense in the Scottish Enlightenment. One of the main sort of sub-schools of the Scottish Enlightenment, something called common sense realism, associated with a thinker named Thomas Reid. It became very influential in the United States, mostly coming through Princeton University, Princeton College then, which was established as a Scottish Presbyterian University, and Scottish thinkers started coming in. Well, they were also very common as tutors and even high school teachers, if you will, but Princeton became a major sort of hub of this form of thinking. And the idea of common sense, realism it was called, was the idea that every human has this innate common moral sense of what's right and wrong. It doesn't have to be proved philosophically. It was it rose in opposition to David Hume's skepticism. David Hume, another one of these Scottish figures, but this sort of countervailing idea said, we don't need to have a philosophical proof for all of our statements. It was just innate moral sense. It was, you could say, given by God to humans that allow us to see these. Now, here's one place we can see this very clearly is in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, second paragraph, well known. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, we don't have to prove them. People have this innate common sense that enables them to see that all men are created equal, which of course they didn't exactly practice entirely, but they had the lofty ideals about them, and then that we are endowed, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson, who was not really a Christian. He was a deist, meaning he thought that God created the world, but then did not intervene in it, and the laws established by the Creator just played themselves out, the natural laws. But you can still see in Jefferson's words this sort of strong spiritual underpinnings, if you will. And it's interesting, Jefferson supposedly first wrote, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, and Benjamin Franklin evidently convinced him to substitute the term self-evident. So a very different understanding. And Britain and the United States continue to be very religious. And the United States even, in a way, more so through the Victorian period, Britain's Victorian period, but through the mid into the late 1800s. The U.S. had a much more, we could say, competitive religious environment without any sort of established church. Unlike Scotland, the Presbyterian Church, in England, the Anglican or Episcopalian Church had these sort of established features, but in the United States had nothing like that. So you got this very competitive environment where you have a variety of new religious sects evolving, a lot of them on the frontier, where you didn't have established churches and ministers, and you get these traveling revivalist movements. But anyway, it's very European, French writers certainly, when they came to the United States, noted how religious Americans tended to be, as contrasted with people in France, who were Catholic in one sense, but the religious fervor much higher in the U.S. And I go into this just to note that there are correlations with fertility and religiosity. We see this still today in the United States, and I'll talk about that later on in the class. So I just have a couple more topics before I end this lecture. But one is that French leaders were very worried about their low birth rate, partly because of growing competition with Germany. That's by the mid-1800s. Germany was broken up into many, many different small states, but one of the larger ones in the northeastern part of Germany was the state of Prussia, and it was growing industrially in terms of population, in terms of military strength by the mid-1800s. And France was rightly very concerned about this. But actually concerns about France's reduced fertility go all the way back to the late 1600s. There was a pro-natalist edict on marriage in 1666. But as the other highlighted text here indicates, the influence of demographic factors was revealed dramatically in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when France was defeated after one major battle against a single opponent. Quite a shock. France had been so militarily dominant on the continent through the Napoleonic period and even beyond, but it was a different story by 1870. So this war pit Prussia, located in the map shows what happened after the war, when Prussia was able to unify most of the German states into this German empire. It fought a war against Austria, then fought one with Denmark as well, but then the big war was against France to enable Prussia to do this unification. Also, Prussia took a very important part of France, Alsace-Lorraine. I've highlighted that in red and annexed it. So it was a crushing, humiliating defeat of France. And you can see by the time of the war, the North German Confederation, which was Prussia and smaller German states in the north that it dominated, essentially had close to population parity with France. The militaries were about the same size, but the Prussians had a much more effective military. They were much faster to utilize modern transportation through trains, railroads, for example, and I won't go into the details here. But this war really, again, worried the French about their low birth rates, and there were many efforts to sort of increase the fertility rate, and didn't work, but efforts were there. And finally, my last slide, I just want to note there are a lot of interesting parallels to the demographic concerns of France in the early 20th century with those of today. So there was an immigrant question with France's low birth rate, but still quite a prosperous society. A lot of immigrants were coming in. At that time, they were mostly from Italy, from Poland, some from Spain, mostly Catholics, and the immigrants did acculturate into French society, but there were a lot of concerns that they wouldn't do so, and just these real worries about sort of lack of reproduction. Those worries came to an end by the post-World War II period, when France, like other countries, had this baby boom, and fertility rate went well above replacement level, but then would subsequently drop down again. And today, although France's birth rate is higher than other European countries, it's still well below the replacement level. And today we're getting, France and most European countries are seeing massive immigration, mostly from Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, but you get some similar concerns. So that's all for today's lecture. The next one will be at the same period of time, but looking at China and Japan. I hope you can tune in for that. Thank you.